Hi everyone, welcome to Sportwork Talks. I am Tatiana Gigoneto and I'm speaking here from Sportworks studio in Lausanne and very happy to have this talk on sustainability series. So I'm going to pass the words to say thanks to Claire, thanks to Matthew. We are in Lausanne, Claire is in London and Matthew is in Austria. So thanks again for your time with us and hope you enjoy as much. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Today is the 5th Sustainability Leadership Series talk, and it's been a few weeks since our last one, so I've really been looking forward to this. Today, we have as our guest Claire Poole, who is the founder and chief executive of the Sport Positive Summit. And I'm really looking forward to this because Claire is a good friend of mine, and she's doing a lot of stuff, good stuff in this space. Today, Claire will be talking about the blueprint for a sustainable sports club. And as you know, it's the same kind of structure as our previous talks. Claire will talk for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be about 20 or 25 minutes for a Q&A afterwards. So please feel free to send your questions through the chat. Ask them throughout the presentation. Don't wait till the end, and I'll get through as many as I can at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Claire, and I'll see you at the end of your presentation.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm just going to kick off, and hopefully you're going to see some slide decks coming up now. Already I can see some slight technical issues. You're getting a preview all the way to the end, so we're just going to spin back. This is what happens with live events, of course. We just did the run through to make sure it works, and then we've ended up all at the end. So you've got a preview there now, and here we are at the start. So it's lovely to be with you all for this session today, and thanks to Sportworks for putting these sessions on. I've super duper enjoyed all of the ones so far, and I'm in really esteemed company. So I'm delighted to be with you today to talk about this really hopefully important topic and something of interest to you all around the blueprint for sustainable sports clubs. So just to kick things off, I'm not going to talk for a long time about this because I know most of you have attended so many of the Sportworks presentations and are active in this space anyway. So you're all very aware why we're talking about sport when it comes to the impacts of climate change and why we're looking to enhance environmental sustainability. So first of all, of course, we know that as well as the rest of the planet and the rest of civil society, sport is really being impacted by climate change. So we can see this through these images of flooded football pitches, super hot days that athletes have to compete in now, coastal erosion, golf courses in Scotland, etc. So we're seeing the impact of climate change already when it comes to sports and sporting events. As well as the fact that we are being impacted by climate change, we know that sport is, albeit a smaller contributor compared to a lot of big industries, but certainly still has its own contribution in terms of impacting our environment. So sports generally involves a lot of travel. In the US, traditions like tailgating, etc. We see a large amount of carbon emissions that come out of these activities and that come from the sports we know and love. Why sport though? Sport, if you compare it to so many other industries, we in sport have this unparalleled reach to meet people where they are and talk to them about this really important topic in a way and through a medium that they absolutely love and are incredibly passionate about it. So association football or soccer, we know, has between 3.5 and 4 billion fans globally. Cricket has 2.5 billion fans, field hockey 2 billion, tennis 1 billion. Incredible figures, and this is the reach that sport offers for us and this challenge. So the sort of perspective I'm going to come to you with today in terms of this blueprint for sustainable sports organisations is just by speaking a little bit about our Sport Positive Leagues, which we launched in 2019, born out of my own nosiness about what organisations were doing around environmental sustainability. So, I'm often asked to speak at these sorts of events, and I speak to so many people globally in regards to sport and sustainability. And they'd always ask me, who are the leaders, what's happening, give us some examples. And I find myself going back to the same ones time and again because those organisations were particularly vocal about their efforts. What I wanted to do was find out by starting with the English Premier League, what every club in that top flight league was doing, and then to sort of understand across the metrics that we know are the most impactful, what initiatives they had and where they were at basically in terms of this environmental sustainability effort. So we launched that with BBC Sport in 2019, and we've done an update in 2020 for last year and are working on 2021 already. And for Bundesliga, we launched earlier this month. We're already working on La Liga, Serie A, Ligue 1, Champions League, and we're looking at other sports as well. So what is the Sport Positive League and what are we actually talking about? This is a tiny screenshot, which most of you are probably doing this now at the screen to see it, but it's just a flavour and for me to talk through what we're doing. So the categories that we look at are the likes of clean energy, energy efficiency, sustainable transport, single-use plastic and waste management, water, plant-based or lower carbon foods, and then efforts around commitments, communications and engagement. So what we do is, this is a metric we've put together in conjunct with some academics to sort of put a rationale, if you like, about starting to give higher points for what we believe indicates good behaviours, but still rewarding those activities where organisations are active, and then giving some bonus points for the ways that we think actually is how we want to promote sport, working on these efforts going forward. And some of those ways that we're looking to help sport on this journey we'll talk about now as we go along. The other reason we wanted to be able to do this and publish this in congress with the clubs and with their involvement is to enable a benchmarking tool for not just football, but other sports as well. And so many people contact me to say that they've used our work to benchmark themselves, not just football clubs, but other sports as well. If they were in this league, how many points would they get and where would they score in comparison to their peers? I've put a red arrow next to Spurs, who came top of our Premier League sustainability table in 2020, because I often get the question, okay, Spurs or VfL Wolfsburg, who took the top spot in our Bundesliga table, they got full points. They got 21 out of 21. So are these now the perfect clubs? Can they do no better? And the answer to that is absolutely not. There's no such thing as perfection. There are always ways to improve and push things further. And we ourselves are evolving the table every year to change the points up, to increase ambition. We're adding new categories in, and we're working year on year, sort of almost coming along with sport in the journey. As sport continues to improve, we make it more difficult to get those top points, and again keep that competition going, but also helping sport all the time to increase ambition on climate. So a helpful benchmarking tool, and maybe something you can have a look at yourself for your organisations and see your activities in these areas and how your activities measure up against some of these clubs. The last point, just to note before I get into the kind of macro issues and the main part of what we want to talk about today, is just another rationale for why we did this was to help publicise progress and support increased ambition on climate. So a lot of sports organisations we find are doing incredible work, but they just don't talk about it. That is for lots of reasons, not just including the fact that sometimes there seems to be a thought process that there are more downsides to talking about this than upsides or benefits. So, you know, putting your head above the parapet a little bit, saying you're doing some work, does that mean you'll be called out for not doing it sooner or not doing enough or not being, you know, not sort of pushing as far as you could? For us, it's all part of the journey, and we try and promote the activities that are happening and applaud the work that's going on, as well as help sort of promote that progress and further ambition. But we've seen, since we launched the leagues in 2019, we have seen that increased ambition. We've seen clubs sign up to the UN Sports for Climate Action Framework. We've seen sustainability strategies be launched. We've seen enhanced publicity in mainstream broadcast about this sort of work. All the time, we're getting new people learning and thinking and discussing what sustainability in sport means, how sport is contributing to climate change, etc. So all good things in terms of our efforts. What I want to talk about for the next 10 minutes before we move to Q&A and some discussion, I've been thinking about, for this presentation and more broadly, what are the sort of macro factors that provide a blueprint for leadership in this area. And this isn't a perfect science. Every sport is different, and we work with clubs, federations, governing bodies, tournaments, tours, athletes, NGOs. There's so many different sort of people and organisations who are involved in this space, and there is not a one-size-fits-all approach, absolutely not, to this work. But what we can sort of pull out when we look at organisations that are perhaps further ahead with this sport, we can start to pull out why they might be further or what they're doing that we might be able to learn from. So the first point that makes everything so much easier, of course, is if you have buy-in or leadership from the very top. So again, for our sport positive leagues, Spurs and Wolfsburg are the top clubs in those particular leagues, just as an example. And Daniel Levy, the chairman of Spurs, is fully in support of this area and pushes that forward, as does Michael Niesk, who's Wolfsburg's managing director. So again, when from our perspective, no matter what size your organisation is or what your ability to drive change, if the people at the very top understand why this is important and buy into the effort that's needed to improve our environmental sustainability efforts, etc., then clearly it can filter down from the top, and it makes everything so much easier because there's basically a mandate for the work to happen. For the most part, a lot of organisations don't have this. Some perhaps do, but it doesn't always filter all the way down. Often I chat to people in sports organisations where they're really trying to promote this change from within, from a lower or middle management perspective. And of course, that's incredibly important, and we'll get there in the end. Sometimes it's just a bit of more of an uphill struggle. But if we pull out how sports organisations are further ahead than others, often you can track it back to the likes of the leadership at the very top, the chairperson, someone on the board, or an MD, really backing and understanding the importance of this work. Another thing that they all have in common is they measure, they monitor, and they report on their impacts. So, as we've all heard a million times in various contexts in sustainability, you can't manage what you don't measure. If you don't know where you're starting off from, how can you monitor what's happening, and how can you possibly know that you are truly sort of making changes that make the most impact, and how can you be sure that if you don't monitor and report that progress is being made? So I put some examples here in terms of that measuring, monitoring and reporting. So FC Köln, who came second in our Bundesliga sustainability table, obviously pre-COVID, but they tracked their fan travel methods to games. We know that travel and transport is one of the biggest impacts of the sports that we play, their impact on the environment. So if you know that 51% of your fans travel by car, 40% by public transport, 6% by bicycle, etc., you can think, right, we know where we're at now. We know that we have to try and promote and understand why 50% of people travel by car. Is it that the public transport doesn't reach where they come from? Is it the most easy, cost-efficient and effective way of travelling? Perhaps there isn't alternatives. Then you can look to make those changes, perhaps partner with organisations or drive real change, safe in the knowledge that you are working in the right way to demand and instigate the best changes. Other examples there from Man City, Wolfsburg, Brighton and Hove Albion. Again, whether it's travel, whether it's water usage, whether it's energy efficiency, etc., most of us have the information about this to hand. We just haven't perhaps looked at it through an environmental lens. You've probably looked at things like water usage or energy efficiency, etc., through a financial lens. How much does it cost? How are we ensuring we're working in the most efficient way? But perhaps you need to now slightly look at that through an environmental lens. So measuring, monitoring and reporting, again, absolutely crucial to what we're doing, and an activity we see with those clubs that are slightly further ahead. In an ideal world, and in the ones that we see that are further ahead on this, they have an environmental or sustainability strategy or policy in place that reaches across the whole organisation. By having some kind of strategy and policy in place, it means that decisions around sustainability and environment are made at every turn because it's part of your internal strategy. If you don't have this, of course, you can still do great work, but it tends to be more piecemeal or as opportunities arise or, on an ad hoc basis, which means that you're never really having the best impacts that you could possibly have. So again, some examples here. Southampton's Halo Effect that they launched earlier this year, Liverpool's The Red Way, FC Köln's environmental strategy, 1899 Hoffenberg's sustainability strategy, etc. All of these clubs that we know are leading the way as part of our sport positive leagues, they have this strategy or policy in place. If you haven't yet, don't worry, all of this, every effort helps, and we'll get to that at the end if you're not really there yet. But if you can start to mobilize what this might look like, what strategy might look like, how you might be able to put a policy in place, and as well have that reach across your entire organization, you're going to ensure that change happens. Again, in things like football or venue sports, we're very focused on the stadium, for example. That's what fans see, that's where fans travel to, and that's what's happening. But if you look at a football club, the stadium is a place that people travel to once or twice a week at the most, whereas there's also training facilities, staff offices, academy facilities, etc. If you're just focused on the stadium, you're missing environmental impacts and your sustainability efforts across your entire operation. So it's about thinking holistically, and it's about thinking strategically about your environmental efforts. Another thing we see with organisations that are slightly further ahead on this effort is that they've made external commitments. They've held themselves to account to actually put this in place. So organisations have signed up to the UN Sports for Climate Action Framework. They've made commitments like being net zero by 2025, or in FC Köln's case by 2021. Southampton signed up to a National Clean Air Day and Southampton's Green Charter. Again, by making this external voluntary commitment, it just means that when you are making decisions internally and you're wondering, we could do this option or this option, you're more likely to choose the environmentally sustainable option because you've made an external commitment and you need to prove to your stakeholders, to your shareholders, to your fans, to your suppliers, etc., that you are going to follow through and reach that commitment. So again, by doing these mostly voluntary commitments and putting it out, it basically puts you in a position where now you have to drive this forward, and it gives you, again, an internal mandate for making sure this work is always prioritised, rather than doing bits and bobs, and if something changes, you kind of forget about it for a while. It's about being consistent, and it's about being committed around this work. The last point on this that we see, which is the big benefit of sport and what we really want sport to achieve, is this education and engagement of fans. Sport itself is a sector. Yes, of course, we have a footprint, but as I said, the size of the impact of sport compared to, agriculture, construction, energy, aviation, etc. Sport itself as an industry isn't necessarily a huge impactor. But we do have an impact, so we have to get our houses in order to be credible. But the reach for us is the fans. We can reach and discuss and have conversations with so many people through our channels. And these are just some examples of clubs, again, that are doing great work that we cover in our leagues, and how they're going about that education or engagement. So Arsenal have a sponsor in Octopus. They have a renewable energy tariff that Arsenal fans can change to. They feel like they're supporting their club. They're making a good decision for the environment. Liverpool, similarly, their activation with their partner Quorn, which is plant-based food, player videos, quizzes, etc., doing meat-free match days, that kind of thing. Again, making it fun, making it engaging, meeting football fans where they are and helping change their perspective on this. A lot of clubs in the Premier, I think 11 clubs in the Premier League as well, are part of Planet Super League, which is a fan engagement activity where fans and families do environmental activities to give their club a chance of winning the Planet Super League trophy. Again, all the time nudging positive behaviours through the reach of your own organisation, be it a club, governing body, a federation, a tour, tournament, etc. We all have this ability to reach fans through communications. And again, we always want to do it in a fun, credible, authentic way when it comes to the sport that we're in. So these are the things that advanced clubs that we look at in our leagues are doing to provide this blueprint for leadership. It's a quick, run through, of course, of the sorts of things that we know make good behaviours. But what if I've been chatting here and you think, I feel like we do a lot of that stuff, but I'm not sure that we would still be called a leader in this space. With that in mind, I think we also come from a place of supporting the sports industry, and we understand that sport organisations have very different resources, timelines, limitations and politics at play. You may have some or all of these efforts in place already, but you might feel as though we're still a long way from where we need to be. There's so many reasons for that in terms of the resources you've got to hand. Post-COVID, a lot of sport organisations have been really pushed with COVID impacts and the lack of fans being able to travel to our great sporting events, etc. You might be under a current contract or a current sponsorship or supplier where it's with an organisation that perhaps you feel undermines possible sustainability credentials and might be hampering progress. But with all of this, I would say, even if you feel like you're doing a lot of things, but you're not where you need to be, don't lose the faith that, contracts will end, supplier contracts will end, sponsorship contracts will end. Get your ducks in a row to make good decisions when those opportunities arise. We're coming through COVID. We're trying to get back to live events and live sports now. Fingers crossed we can progress through that. So even if you feel like you've got a lot of this, but you're not quite there yet, I would say, keep the faith, keep talking about progress and keep going, because whether you've got an amazing, all singing, all dancing sustainability strategy, or whether you're just doing what you can right now, it all counts. What if you're not there yet at all? What if you're like, Claire, this all sounds brilliant, but we're nowhere near this. We're at the very start of this journey. She's mad. What can we possibly do that's not, that isn't going to be this necessarily right now with this sustainability strategy, but what can we do in the moment to start driving change? Advice here, start where you are and do something. It doesn't matter how small it was, it's how small it is. It might be using your position to influence changes in your sector. So maybe, you're in a junior or middle management role and you only have a certain remit. You're trying to get change to happen organisation-wide, but you're not quite there yet. What can you do in your position to make positive changes that's inside your remit? Still do it, still get to work on that. Look at partners. How can you work with current or existing partners to make better environmental decisions? Can catering partners provide more plant-based options at your upcoming tournament? Can you chat to your waste management company about starting to move less away from landfill or get rid of some single-use plastic options that you use, etc. What small decisions can you make that will funnel into bigger strategy in the future? Find like-minded people in your organisation, start a monthly ideas session, start a sustainability team where people just get together virtually once a month for an hour to chat about what could we do, what change could we affect, where do we want to be. It can be informal and ad hoc, but again, joining together with like-minded peers in your organisation or in your sport can really help generate momentum in this area. So maybe you could try something like that. Connect with industry peers, so like we're doing now, find out what other people are doing, find out how they got to where they are and what decisions went into those to getting them that little bit further ahead. And lastly, always ask questions and bang the drum to leadership, raise their awareness about what others are doing inside your sport or in different sports and how progress is moving forward in this sector and how, benefits are being seen from that effort. We don't want to be left behind. We can see that organisations are getting commercial sponsorship now because of their sustainability efforts, etc. Keep raising awareness of this effort and banging that drum. So final thoughts before we get on to any Q&A. Embedding sustainability at the heart of sport and this elusive blueprint for success is all a journey. Yes, some organisations are further ahead than others, but that is not because they've got something that you haven't got. They just maybe started sooner. Maybe they've got more buy-in. Maybe they had more resources, but all of them started with a first action. So, and they're all still on a journey. There's no such thing as perfection. What we want to try and encourage you to do is benchmark where you are, improve on that and report it, whether it's internally or externally, so that you know your efforts are going in the right direction. If you can start doing things, try and do them consistently so it doesn't become a flash in the pan. Even if it's a small effort, try and be consistent with it. We know perfection doesn't exist. Climate change is a huge issue, as is biodiversity loss. We're not all running a race to hit a goal and then we can all just go back to business as usual. There's no such thing as perfection. We're in this continual evolution of how we need to change our activities, our behaviours and our businesses to be more sustainable for the future. And if I can say one thing, start anywhere, start somewhere, but just start now. Take it off the back burner and just think, how can we start doing small efforts now, even if we can't get to this blueprint for success in the next 12 months. So some thoughts for you. I'm delighted to be with you and thank you for your time and attention, and I'd be delighted to chat further about any of this and answer any questions you've got.
Claire, thank you for a wonderful, comprehensive presentation. We've got people dialing in from all corners of the globe for this presentation. With people from the Philippines, with people from Zimbabwe, India, Canada, all over the place. Wow. And questions have come thick and fast. So I'm going to go straight to the questions from the audience.
Brilliant.
First question I'll go to is from Martha. Irene, I'll get to your question a little bit later because it's a little bit technical. So I'll ask Claire that question a little bit further down the line. But I'll go for Martha's question first. And Martha is asking, how can we help organizations talk about the great work they're doing? Knowing so many are worried about the downsides, what can we do to alleviate their fear and encourage them to share more?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question and something we talk about all the time. So I actually a part of the UN Sports for Climate Action framework, and I sort of head up a co-chair a communications group in there, and it's something we talk about all the time. For me, every sports organisation is different, so there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, but what we can say and what we know for sport is that you have to be credible and authentic in your messaging. So you need to understand your fans and you need to reach them where they are. So however that communication and that messaging manifests, it has to be engaging, it has to be, fun, potentially, it has to be educational, depending on the group that you're looking to engage. But really it's about, how can your audience engage with this issue in a way that they care about? So a way a sailing organisation might engage their fans around perhaps ocean plastic or, the sort of ocean plastic, but also things like this increasingly hot days and the issues that set off with reflection, this increasing heat that we're seeing and being on the water all the time. And there's so many impacts that you can tap into that are specific to your sport. So I would say in terms of comms, don't worry about being really general about always talking about climate change and the big issues. Think about the impacts on your sport that's going to impact the fans who care about and love the game or the sport that you play, and think about how you can meet them in a way that's credible and authentic to you, that makes sense for the fans, really. I think it's so specific per organisation, but we always want to try and meet the fans where they are, speak their language, and meet them in a way where it touches on what they care about, basically.
I'll go to Irene's question now. Irene's from Canada, and she's talking about the fact that a number of Canadian organisations have signed up to the Sports for Climate Action framework. Yeah. And she's asking, is it important, or how important is it to measure emissions kind of as a nation, as a sector, rather than individually? Is that something that is that'd be important going forward, or is it just easier to report as an individual organisation?
So I think in terms of where we are right now, individual organisations benchmarking and reporting is massive, because so many, in terms of this sector, in terms of environmental sustainability, it isn't the majority of sport organisations already that are doing that. Many are, but not all of them. So I think getting individual organisations to benchmark and report is where we're at right now. Whether it's a sector-wide footprint in the future is certainly something that's up for discussion. I think in terms of that, who is the organisation who would oversee that? How would it actually work? There'd be a lot of questions around how that would happen. I guess if we actually got all sports, perhaps in a nation like Canada, if all sports were reporting on their own emissions, another organisation could obviously bundle all those together and give an overall footprint. For me, in terms of where we are as an industry right now, just getting that individual benchmarking and reporting would be absolutely incredible. Then maybe that sector-wide or country-wide impact in the future is a possibility.
Following on from that question, Alex is asking, have you come across any tools or platforms that are being used for measuring and monitoring? And where can you find them?
Yeah, so in terms of those, there's a lot of carbon calculators that are out there. There's lots of different platforms. So I think, Matt, the sustainability report with sustainability.sport, I think there's calculators and stuff on there. I know Aileen, who's on the call today, has got a huge amount of information in terms of case studies, information calculators, etc. So in terms of that benchmarking, there isn't kind of the one that we direct you all to, but there are, if you just literally put it into Google, there are eco calculators that are out there. But a lot of sports organisations would work with sort of external providers or consultants to benchmark and report on their own emissions based on very specific calculations. But certainly there's enough out there on the internet where you could get a ballpark idea of where you're at with things to use it as a jumping off point for that.
Yeah, Alex, if you look slightly up the chat, you'll find the links that Claire was talking about within Eileen's post, and then you'll be able to find access to all of those. Next question comes from Jens, and he's asking about the fact that some of the clubs who have been mentioned in the presentation do have sponsors who are a large CO2 emitters. That's unavoidable. There are a number of sponsors. How do we reconcile that at this stage?
Yeah, it's a really important point, and if most of you, I'm sure, have read the report that came out recently, Sweat Not Oil, which was put together by Rapid Transition Alliance, etc. And this idea of large emitters sponsoring football or sports organisations more generally is obviously an issue, and it's a difficult sort of peg to square right now. Where we are, I think, with it is, from my perspective, of course, we want to move away from that as far as possible. It goes without saying that, of course, if all sponsors of major sporting tournaments, etc., could be entirely, fossil free or, entirely clean and pure, that would be amazing. For us, where we are right now is there's different facets to that in terms of environmental sustainability, because we do still live in a fossil economy. So those organisations are there. I think there's a lot of progress to be made, and it's something we're going to report on in the future in terms of the organisations that are sponsoring. And I know there's other work happening in this area as well from some of our colleagues. It's a complex issue. If you look at the thin end of the wedge, obviously, much like if the Sweat Not Oil report referenced it in regard to tobacco back in the 80s and 90s and getting rid of tobacco sponsorship off sports. Is there a likelihood that that will happen in sport as well? Very possibly, as we move away from fossil and move towards clean energy, etc. However, a lot of these are historical contracts, etc., and a lot of these organisations now, are moving forward and have credible rationales to move towards cleaner energy, etc. So I think it's an incredibly complex issue. The straightforward answer is, of course, we need to move away from them as far as possible. But for a lot of sporting organisations, not being sponsored by those organisations, if the money isn't manifesting elsewhere, means the end of their sport, or the end of that tournament, or puts them in a financially untenable position. So it's a more complex issue, and I think we should definitely have another session just about that as well, because it's huge. But certainly I think where we are right now in terms of the journey sports on, we are trying to applaud positive measures in this area rather than call out organisations for perhaps decisions that are historic situations, sponsorship that's ongoing, etc., and that might be a little bit more complex. But certainly perhaps there's other NGOs and other organisations in the space that would take a stronger view on that than perhaps we would in terms of supporting sport in moving towards more sustainable practices.
I've got a question following on from that, and it's around, you talked about the fact that there are some sports organisations and clubs who are in these long sponsorships that they have to kind of manage that relationship, and they're staying in it through for a number of other years. How do you manage that kind of relationship if you're in that relationship? And is there an opportunity for sport to influence these partners in a positive way in the remaining years of that partnership?
Yeah, I think very much so. And again, I think I hear a lot of these conversations being had, especially with perhaps organisations that are trying to get rid of single-use plastic, but have a partner that traditionally provides beverages in that sort of packaging. So I think, again, the power that sport has to have those conversations with suppliers. We're moving towards these goals. How can we bring you along with us? What plans have you got in place to move forward in this way? Is there other options available for our sponsorship packages, etc., or supporting packages? So I think the best sort of relationships we see in sport is where suppliers become more like partners, and actually they engage, sports and suppliers engage in this journey together to be better, and they help each other along the way. So I think it's absolutely a conversation. If you're in that situation, it's absolutely a conversation you should be having with your sponsors, and vice versa. A lot of sport organisations aren't particularly sustainable themselves yet, so they're starting this journey, and they realise that now this might be an issue in the future, so they need their sponsors to come on this journey with them. So it's not just about the brands; often it's about the sport as well, and then working together to a more positive future.
Question here from Oyan. Oyan saying the index, the table is focused mainly on the environmental side of sustainability. Will Sport Positive be looking at the other aspects of sustainability going forward? Is that the next frontier for the tables?
Yeah, so for us, we are, completely unabashed about our focus on environmental sustainability. The reason for that is because there's quite a few organisations out there that focus much more on the other elements of sustainability, so perhaps the social or the governance or the financial. When we started our work in this area, all of those other areas generally in sport are pretty well covered. What we found was that this environmental angle of it was quite missing. So if you look at we've used football clubs in this example. If you look at leagues, clubs, websites, etc., it's usually very easy to find a foundation or a community page that looks at, supporting local communities. Very importantly, of course, things like kicking out racism, bullying, etc. There's usually no shortage of that stuff. But the environmental sustainability angle or our impact on the climate is usually missing. And that's why for us, that's why we've started in this. It's the area that needs the most focus, if you like. So that's why we're focused on that. At our summit and through our other efforts, we obviously cover things like diversity, equity and inclusion, governance, etc. more broadly. But also we're not sort of shy about the fact that we do focus on the environmental sustainability element, and that might only be one of the elements for you in terms of your sustainability strategy, but we can help with that environmental sustainability / climate change perspective.
Question from Phil here, Claire. And Phil is asking, do you think there's an opportunity for football clubs to promote their sustainability initiatives to fans on a match day?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we love seeing stuff like that. A lot of organisations will, use some of their boards advertising around the pitch, etc., for these sorts of activations. Match day, when we can get fans back into stadiums, match day is an amazing time to engage fans, whether it's a football stadium or a tennis courts or a cricket ground, wherever it is. We have fans coming, they are eating, they are drinking, they are being around. We can help educate them around water usage, around recycling, waste, plant-based food options. We can educate them in fun ways around their impacts by coming to the game and how they can help reduce that, etc. So obviously we've missed that with COVID, with not being able to attend sports over the last 12 months or so, but certainly a huge amount of effort around fan engagement during sports matches, and actually arguably, of course, the biggest way we can actually reach fans physically with this messaging.
I suppose one of the few negative aspects of fans coming back to stadiums will be the amount of travelling that happens after that. And Lucas's question kind of piggybacks on that topic. And he's saying professional football is based around travelling. Is it even possible to have an environmentally friendly professional football industry because of that?
It's a bit, well, for all sport, and we now live in a globalized world. So in terms of having a truly sustainable industry in terms of sport based on that travel, it's a big question because, of course, for the most part, what teams, whether it's a home or away match, or whether you're a big tennis fan and you follow the Grand Slams round, or maybe you compete in marathons or whatever, most stuff doesn't happen within walking distance of our houses. So that element of travel is there. So whilst we have to be cognizant of that as a sector's perspective, so that going forward, we might want to change schedules, we might want to reduce the number of regular season, games or matches, we might want to try and encourage different training camps, etc., to be closer to home, and there's ways that we can reduce that. We're never going to get rid of that entirely, which is why once we've reduced as far as possible, we have to invest in things like carbon sinks, etc., to offset the impacts that we have. When it comes to can sport be truly sustainable because of that, as being an ambassador for kind of sport and the importance of our sector to culture, I would also say, can you envisage a time where business travel is reduced to the point that it's truly sustainable? There's so many reasons that people travel for holidays, for business, for, sport comparatively is probably, again, tiny compared to people traveling to see family, to go on vacation, to travel for business, to attend conferences and events, etc. So at what point will we measure ourselves against that, and will those industries be truly sustainable as well? So they're big questions, and I think from our perspective, what we think is, can we start to encourage, especially federations and governing bodies, to think about the timing of schedules, how many matches take place across a regular season, when tournaments happen, where they take place, where people travel from, and how we can make that as efficient as possible, and then go on to sort of reduce, offset, and invest in carbon sinks to get rid of the unavoidable emissions that will always be there in terms of sport, but also in terms of business and in terms of most of our day-to-day lives anyway.
Got a really interesting question here from Basil, and he's asking, do you envisage a time when FIFA, UEFA and other governing bodies have the power to impose requirements on football clubs to engage in sustainable activities? I guess they were pretty quick in shutting down the ESL, European Super League last week, so they do have some element of power. But do you think they can impose compliance in this way?
Physically, I think they could, obviously. Whether it would be palatable to do so is obviously quite a different issue. It's sport compared to perhaps business or corporate more generally runs a very different line. If you look at the way governing bodies, federations, etc. operate, or if you look at leagues and clubs that sit within them, a lot of the time it's not black and white. That it's not like a government passing down, you have to do this. So those mandates, it's something that would be great to see in terms of looking at sustainability in the same way as perhaps other metrics that are mandated by leagues and governing bodies in terms of other factors of the sport. But again, if you look at the bigger picture, even the Paris Agreement is a voluntary commitment where 196 nations have signed up to reduce carbon emissions. Even that can be rescinded. People can take entire countries can take them out of that. So again, in terms of the level that federations and governing bodies are working at and the multiple stakeholders they have to work with and the politics at play, I'd love eventually one day to see that happen. And I think in our lifetime, it probably will. Big statement, but I think, I do think we will end up going that way because the impacts of climate change obviously gaining and gaining and gaining. But I think it will be further along the line than an immediate reaction, because as we see now, a lot of it is around voluntary commitments.
Got a question from from Sarah here, asking, do you see sports organisations starting to look into Scope 3 emissions, such as business travel and fan travel to matches? Do you think that's the next stage in sustainability commitments?
Yes, very much so. And I think a lot of organisations now that are committing to net zero, sports organisations that are looking at that, they have to consider Scope 3. Scope 3 is obviously the biggest of the emitters. So just in case people aren't aware, so Scope 1, 2 and 3 are the kind of emissions that we create, Scope 1 is all direct emissions from organisations, Scope 2 is indirect emissions, and then Scope 3 is all other indirect emissions. So Scope 3 is basically activities of an organisation that happen because of it, but that are outside of its control. So in this case, if you are putting together net zero targets, etc., you can't avoid Scope 3 because for sport, that's where the majority of our emissions come from. However, of course, in the cases of travel, they're unavoidable emissions if you have an event that people travel to either locally or internationally. So what we have to do is try and minimise those emissions as far as possible, and then invest in carbon sinks and other ways that we can, create a carbon positive environment to offset the negative amount of carbon that we're creating. But it's very important that offset and the investment into climate sinks is the last port of call. You're not being truly sustainable if you just go straight to offsets without changing any behaviour or trying to reduce your own emissions as far as possible. So very important to do it in the right way. And if you look at something like Climate Neutral Now, which is by UNFCCC, it will show you the sort of process to getting to being climate neutral that you can look at and you can sign up to voluntarily. But yeah, I think you absolutely have to consider Scope 3. There is going to be unavoidable emissions, and we are going to have to work in ways to offset those, because in most cases, to keep our sports viable, we can't avoid them.
We're coming close to the end of the session, but we've got a couple more questions. Elliot's got a question, which is, I suppose, similar to the previous one. Elliot's saying that in some cases, 100% green energy provision may not be 100% true. How can we ensure more rigour in the information that football clubs provide? I think he's talking in more general terms, but how can we ensure that clubs are being factual and rigorous about this process?
Yeah, I think whenever organisations sign up to a renewable energy provider, they should receive a certificate based on that. Again, it's like we have to be pragmatic about it. Organisations, individuals inside sports organisations going to go to an offshore wind farm to make sure that's where there's also a level of there's only so much you can do, and you have to rely on the honesty of others to actually do it. But when you do, whether you're an individual consumer or whether you are a large-scale organisation, when you do take out a renewable energy contract or energy contract and it comes from a renewable source, they should be able to furnish you, especially for a large-scale sports organisation, they should be able to furnish you with a certificate that shows your energy came from a renewable source. So that's something you could request to ensure that rigour, rather than perhaps, if in your case, Elliot, maybe you're being told something's renewable energy but you haven't seen the proof, something like that kind of certificate could make sense.
Abigail's asking about whether sports clubs can tie, strong alliances with city administrations, for example, to work towards sustainability goals together. Have you seen any examples of this?
Yeah, well, we see this a huge amount with tournaments and games. So whether it's like the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games, or organisations like F1 that travel to different cities or have a tour programme, Formula E, etc. So we always see in those situations that there are very close ties between, and good partnerships between the sports organisation and the city in which they're operating. Generally to make sure that the operations that are happening cement prosperity for both the organisation that's going there and also the city or the town that it's taking place in. But again, there's a massive opportunity there around environmental sustainability and legacy. So how can, when organisations do have their sporting event happen in a certain town or city, etc., how can we ensure that there's an environmental sustainability legacy there? For organisations that don't tour or travel, there will obviously be relationships between stadiums and local councils or local administrative bodies, but how can they work together to, for example, provide more active transport routes, or better signpost the way people can travel to games by walking or by bicycle or by public transport? Can we do things like incentive packages so that when you, like they do in Germany, when you buy a ticket to the game, you get free travel on match day in that area, for example? So all of these, the connection between sports organisers and city leaders, etc., is a really important one, and one I think, especially for the transport element, we can see going forward that's going to be much more important to drive those changes.
Final question coming here from Jeremy. And Jeremy's asking, Jeremy's saying each sport and club are different, but what are some of the more impactful calls to action you've seen in engaging fans to nudge their behaviour?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jeremy. Lovely to see you, hear you on the session. So for us, there's loads of examples of this, and we can send some around afterwards as well. But one that always springs to mind because Norman Voschelt is a good friend of mine in the Summit and Sport Positive. The Philadelphia Eagles have like signage around their stadium, like in the toilets above the men's urinals, like recycle your beer here and your plastics outside. There's things like that where you can do stuff that's fun and engaging, that has an environmental message, but meets your fans where they are. And Jeremy, Aileen McManaman, who's on the call as well, and Brian McCullough, who was on and just jumped off, are real experts in this fan engagement piece. So definitely catch up with them as well. They'll be able to give you more examples of that, and we cover it a lot in our summit. We always have a big fan engagement piece. But in terms of the impact, engaging fans to nudge their behaviour, I think have the environmental perspective, keep it fun, keep it engaging, and often sort of tongue-in-cheek or silly fun stuff is a way that people will remember it when you think about it as well. So loads of examples of that.
Thanks very much, Claire. We've had loads and loads of questions. I haven't been able to get through all of them. Some of them have been a bit more technical in scope, so I will share those with you after the presentation, and maybe you can get back to the questioners in due course with fuller answers. Very big thank you to everyone who joined us today for engaging with this session and for asking some wonderful questions. Claire, thanks for joining us. It's been a great presentation. It's been wonderful. Thank you for giving us a great presentation and for being so generous with your time with the Q&A. To all of you who are interested in the topic, keep an eye out for our next Sustainability Leadership Series talk. You'll be getting information via Sportworks or through the Sustainability Report, so keep an eye out for that one. In the meantime, thank you for joining us. Stay well, stay safe, and goodbye from Claire and myself.